She stood at the edge of the polished city building, like a ghost no one had invited, her fingers brushing against the cold surface of the revolving glass doors, feeling for a seam, a welcome, a way in, not knowing yet that the world on the other side had already decided she didn't belong. The wind pushed at her coat, her scarf flapping like a forgotten flag as she adjusted the plastic bag in her hand, full of homemade cookies she'd baked for the mayor himself, not because she needed anything, but because her grandchildren said this meeting was to honor her, to thank her for years of unseen work in the community. And now, here she was, trembling but proud, wearing the only coat she had that still looked nice, her silver hair pulled back with a faded blue ribbon that had belonged to her late husband, her steps slow but sure, the metal tip of her cane tapping gently as she moved forward. But the second she crossed the threshold, the warmth of purpose in her chest turned to chill as a man's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Excuse me, ma'am, you can't be making that kind of noise in here." And it wasn't just what he said, it was how flat, sharp, the practiced tone of someone who'd already filed her under trouble, even though she hadn't spoken a word. He stood behind the front desk, white shirt starched, name tag gleaming, and eyes that scanned her with a look that said more than any policy ever could. "You don't belong here." And Martha, that was her name, paused, lips parted as if to ask something kind, something polite. But the way he stepped around the desk toward her made it clear this wasn't a conversation. It was an eviction, and as her fingers instinctively pulled her coat tighter around her chest, he waved, his hand toward the exit, and said it again, louder, slower, like she didn't understand English. "You'll need to leave, ma'am. This is a professional space, and you're disturbing the lobby." And just like that, the cold from the glass returned, not from the door, but from the eyes now turning toward her. The receptionist whispering to a colleague, a security guard straightening his back across the hall, and Martha stood still, not because she was confused, but because the scene was too familiar, too rehearsed, too exhausting. The world always moving to remove her, to minimize her. Even now, in a building she had helped clean during the city's strike 30 years ago. Even now, when she had come not as a protester, but as a guest. She tried to explain, voice soft but steady, "I have an appointment with the mayor." And the man actually laughed, a dry puff of sound, tilting his head like she'd just told him she was royalty. And behind him, the security guard began walking over, and suddenly all she could feel was the weight of every time she had been told she was too loud, too poor, too black, too something for the space she was in. And as the guard reached for her elbow, she whispered again, quieter now, as if the building itself might listen better than the people inside it. "I'm not here to cause trouble." But the hand still gripped her arm, not hard, not violent, just firm, official, dismissive, and the man's voice followed them toward the door. "It's not personal, ma'am, but you're creating a disruption." And with every step she took, led back into the cold street she had just left, she realized something awful. This wasn't the first time someone looked at her and didn't see a person, and it wouldn't be the last. She stood on the sidewalk, holding her cane in one hand and the plastic bag in the other, her fingers trembling not from age but from the sting of humiliation that clung to her skin like frost, her eyes lifting slowly to the massive building that had just swallowed her and spit her out as if she were nothing more than noise. And in that upward glance there was no awe, no wonder, only the silent question every black elder has asked at least once. How many times must I be pushed out before I stop, trying to walk in? Inside, the man who'd dismissed her had already turned back to his desk, and when the security guard returned, he muttered something under his breath that sounded like, "They always think rules don't apply to them." And the woman behind the front counter giggled, not cruelly, just comfortably, the way people do when they've convinced themselves that decency is optional when dealing with someone like Martha, someone who didn't wear a blazer, someone whose skin and silence made her too easy to dismiss, someone who looked like the past they pretend to respect but never want to face. And outside, the cold began to settle in her joints. the concrete under her worn shoes hard and indifferent, as passing feet stepped around her, without slowing, and Martha, standing there, wanted to shrink, to disappear, not from shame, but from weariness, the deep kind, the kind that builds after decades of fighting to be seen by a world that only knows how to look through you. She considered, turning back toward the bus stop, calling her grandson, saying it wasn't worth the trouble. But something in her spine held firm, a memory maybe, of her father being turned away from a diner in '62, or her sister being told she looked too proud to get hired. Or maybe it was the bitter sound of that man's voice, the way he'd said, noise, like her very existence was disruptive. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out the folded paper with the appointment details, the official letter from the mayor's office with her name typed clearly across the top. But what good was proof when people refused to see you as real? She stared at it anyway, just to remind herself she wasn't imagining it, and that was when a young woman in a grey jacket paused beside her, hesitant, watching. "Excuse me," the woman said, eyes flicking toward the building, then back to Martha. "Did they just make you leave?" Martha gave the smallest nod, and the woman's face darkened, not with surprise but with recognition, because she'd seen it before too, the performance of politeness used as a mask for exclusion. "They always do that," the woman muttered. "If you don't look like them, if you don't sound like them, you're always a problem." Martha didn't answer, didn't need to, because the words were too familiar, too carved into the script of her life. And as the woman walked away, Martha remained, standing still under a sky that seemed suddenly farther away, the wind curling around her like a question, and somewhere behind the glass, the man at the desk leaned back in his chair, satisfied, unaware that the woman he had removed like clutter was the reason the mayor was even coming today, and that very soon the doors he'd closed would swing open in a way he could not control. The moment the security guard's hand touched her arm, something inside Martha turned to stone, not out of fear, but because she had felt this exact grip before, decades earlier, in a different city, under different laws, but the same rules, always the same. Move along. Don't raise your voice. Don't make it worse. And so she moved, slowly, carefully, her feet sliding on the polished floor, head held high not from pride, but habit, because black women her age had been trained to walk with dignity even while being dragged, even while being erased, and the guard didn't say a word as he escorted her out, just kept his eyes forward like she was luggage left in the wrong place, something to be removed without emotion. And when they reached the glass doors, he let go, not harshly, but with the cold finality of someone who saw no person in her at all. "Try again with an appointment next time," the front desk man called after her, though she had one, and she turned just enough to look back to say something. But his expression stopped her. His smile was casual, the kind that floats on the surface of people who've never had to think twice about their power. And behind him, a few visitors glanced over, looked at her coat, her skin, her bag, her age, and returned to their phones as if her removal was the resetting of order. Outside, her hand trembled as she picked up the cane that had slipped from her fingers when the guard brushed past her, and the cold had crept into her knees now, tightening every step as she moved toward the bench near the sidewalk. A bench she had sat on before during bus strikes, protest marches, hunger drives. And now she sat again, but this time, not as a fighter, not as a voice, but as a problem, politely, eliminated. Her plastic bag of cookies crinkled in her lap, untouched, and the ribbon on her wrist, blue, old, fraying, fluttered in the wind as if even it wanted to leave. And still no one asked if she was all right. No one checked if she needed help, because to them she was just another elderly black woman with no place to be and no reason to stay. Inside, the building hummed on without her, the man at the desk settling back into comfort, saying under his breath to no one, "People like that always bring drama." And no one corrected him. No one challenged the idea that noise could come from someone who hadn't said a word, because noise to them was never about sound. It was about presence, about existing where they didn't expect you, didn't want you and Martha, who had once marched through clouds of tear gas, who had once spoken into broken microphones for justice, now sat in the shadow of a building that had claimed progress, while throwing her out the same door it would later open, wide for cameras and speeches. And as she looked down at the folded mayor's letter still clutched in her hand, smudged from the grip of insult, she whispered to no one, "I was invited." But the building had already forgotten her face. Let's pause for a brief moment. If you're listening right now, tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from? Have you ever experienced something like this, or seen someone go through it? We'd love to hear your story, and if these moments speak to you, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one. We continue. Martha sat motionless on the bench as people passed her by like wind past a broken tree, her hands resting in her lap, one gently squeezing the letter, the other gripping the plastic bag like a thread still tying her to the purpose she came for. But inside her, a storm had already begun, silent but vast, the kind that doesn't announce itself with thunder, but with stillness, because humiliation doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just sits beside you, invisible to everyone but you, tightening your throat with each breath. The cold had crept deeper now, not just into her joints, but into the spaces inside her that once burned with certainty, and she wondered, not for the first time, if this city had ever truly made room for her, or if every time they opened a door, it was only so they could close it again when no one was looking. Across the street, a school bus unloaded children, and one girl in braids looked at Martha for a split second, curious, but her mother tugged her away quickly, without a word, as if warning her not to stare too long at a woman who looked like sorrow in human form. Meanwhile, inside the building, the man behind the desk laughed at something on his phone, unaware that the same woman he'd tossed out like an error in the system was the reason the mayor himself was about to arrive. Because back at City Hall, Martha's grandson, Isaiah, had seen her message. Just a single sentence, "I'm outside." And it had stopped his breath. He knew what she meant. He knew she wouldn't say more unless something had gone terribly wrong. And within minutes, he was calling the mayor's private office, voice shaking with urgency, explaining that the guest of honor, the woman they were set to publicly recognize for her decades of unshakable work in the community, had been denied entry because she was making noise, because she was causing disruption, because she was seen before she was known, and dismissed before she was heard. The mayor, a man who had marched beside Martha in his youth, who had called her a living archive of dignity, felt a heat rise in him he hadn't felt in years, and without a word to his advisors, he cancelled the remaining meetings and headed toward the building himself. Jacket thrown over his shoulder, face set like stone. He didn't tell the cameras, didn't call for press, didn't prepare a statement. He just went, because there are moments that don't need speeches, only action. And as his car pulled up near the sidewalk, where Martha still sat, his eyes met hers through the glass, and in that instant, he knew that something had broken. Not just in her, but in the story of the city itself, and that the damage had been done before the apology could even form. The car stopped in front of the building, tires screeching slightly as it pulled to a stop. The mayor's heart raced, though his expression didn't show it. He had spent years walking in and out of city offices, shaking hands, attending meetings, hearing praise for his policies and initiatives. He had been praised for being the face of progress, the man who promised to bring change to a city rife with inequality. But standing here now, watching the building that had just rejected the woman who had been a cornerstone of that very change, he realized he had been blind. He had been part of a system that pretended to open doors while quietly locking them behind the people who needed them most. Martha, the woman he admired, the woman who had fought for justice and equality when no one else had the courage to stand up, had just been humiliated, kicked out, discarded, not by the system, but by the very people who claimed to represent it. His chest tightened with each step he took toward the entrance. The doorman saw him first, his eyes widening in shock. The mayor wasn't supposed to be here. His schedule had been cleared, his day planned meticulously. But now, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was Martha. She had been left on the cold bench outside, while the city kept going about its business, pretending everything was fine. The doorman quickly moved aside as the mayor pushed through the glass doors and stepped into the lobby, where the air seemed suddenly still, the voices of the building's occupants quieting as if they too felt the tension building in the air. The mayor's shoes clicked loudly against the marble floors as he moved toward the front desk. The young man who had turned Martha away earlier still stood behind the counter, a cocky smile lingering on his face. He hadn't noticed the mayor approach until he was just a few feet away. The mayor stopped in front of him, his eyes locked onto the young man's, and for a long moment, no one spoke. The smile faltered, the confidence draining from his posture as he realized who stood before him. "What is this?" the mayor asked, his voice calm but heavy with authority. The young man straightened, blinking in confusion. Excuse me, sir. You kicked out a guest of mine, someone who was invited by me to be here today." The mayor's voice was steady but unyielding, each word falling like a hammer. "A woman who has done more for this city than most people in this building have in their entire careers." The young man swallowed, his eyes darting nervously. I didn't know. She was making noise, causing a disturbance. I asked her to leave. She wouldn't." The mayor cut him off, his voice rising, frustration beginning to leak into his words. "She was a guest of the mayor's office. She has every right to be here. You don't even know who you kicked out, do you?" The young man's face flushed with embarrassment. He stammered, struggling to regain his composure, but the mayor wasn't done. "Do you know who Martha is? Do you know what she's done for this city?" The mayor's voice shook slightly with anger, but there was a controlled fury there too. "She fought for civil rights in this very city when it wasn't safe. She led protests, worked tirelessly for the black community when no one else would. She's more than a guest. She's a pillar of this city, and you treat her like trash because she's making noise." The young man's face twisted, unsure whether to argue or apologize. His mouth opened and closed a few times, but no words came out. Behind him, another staff member appeared, her face a mix of guilt and confusion. She stepped toward the mayor cautiously, trying to offer some semblance of explanation. "Mr. Mayor, we didn't know. She didn't look like someone who would be, important." The words stung. They weren't even trying to hide it. It wasn't just that they had kicked out Martha, it was how they had seen her all along. To them, she wasn't a woman of honor, a symbol of justice. She was an inconvenience, a problem, someone who didn't belong in their world. "Is that how you treat all your guests?" the mayor shot back, his tone dripping with disdain. "By deciding whether they belong based on how they look? Is that the standard here?" The staff member looked down, but the damage had already been done. There was no coming back from this. The mayor's presence had shifted the energy in the room, and now the people around him were suddenly very aware of how deeply they had failed. Not just Martha, but themselves. They had let the city's past and present collide in the worst way possible, and they hadn't even realized it. The mayor turned, his frustration bubbling over. "Where is she? Where did you take her?" The staff member hesitated. "She's outside, sir, on the bench." The mayor didn't wait for another word. He strode toward the door, his mind racing with thoughts of how he had failed to see it all sooner. Martha wasn't just a part of the city's history. She was the history, the real heart of it, the one who had worked, fought, bled and lived for change long before people like him came into power. And yet, they all pretended that the work had been done, that the city was clean and polished, ready to move forward, while people like Martha were cast aside as disruptions. He stepped outside, and for a moment, the brightness of the afternoon sun blinded him. He squinted, searching the bench where he had seen Martha only moments ago. There she was, sitting quietly, her cane resting across her lap, the bag of cookies still in her hand. She hadn't moved. She hadn't even looked up when he approached, but he knew she had seen him. "Martha," he said gently, standing a few feet away from her, his voice softer now, filled with the weight of apology. She looked up slowly, her face unreadable, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes that made him pause. She said nothing at first, simply watching him. The moment stretched between them like an eternity. "I'm sorry," the mayor said, his voice thick with regret. I should have been there. I should have protected you. Martha's eyes softened, but her voice was calm, measured. It's not you I need protection from, Mr. Mayor. It's people who think they have the right to decide who belongs and who doesn't. The words stung, and he could see the years of hurt in her gaze. The system had failed her, and here he was, only now understanding how deeply the wounds ran. But I want to make this right, he said, quietly. I'll speak to the people in there. I'll fix this. Martha shook her head, a small, sad smile playing at the corners of her lips. You can't fix this with words, son. You can't change how people see you just by speaking at them. The work, real change, it's done in the heart, not in the speeches. The mayor stood there, silent, feeling the weight of her words press down on him. He had spent so much time working on policies, on speeches, on programs. But now, with Martha's words hanging in the air, he realized that the hardest work wasn't the kind he could write in a speech. It wasn't the kind that could be legislated. It was the kind of work that had to be done every day, in every small act of kindness, in every moment of recognizing the humanity in others, no matter their skin, their age, or their history. I'll do better, he promised, though he knew it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was a place to start. Martha didn't respond immediately. She simply stood, her cane tapping lightly against the concrete, and with one final glance at him, she began to walk away, leaving him standing there, facing the consequences of a system that had rejected her. But it wasn't over yet. He could feel it. There was work to be done, and if he was going to be the man who made change, he had to start by facing the past, her past, and the unacknowledged pain of those who had come before him. He followed her a few steps, but this time he didn't try to stop her. Instead, he walked beside her, letting her lead the way, knowing this wasn't just a moment for apology. It was a moment for action, and as they walked together, he made a vow to himself. He would spend the rest of his career earning back what had been stolen from her, and from so many others like her, by a world that had never bothered to listen. The wind was sharp as it cut through the city streets, and as Martha walked beside the mayor, she could feel the tension between them, not the kind that boiled over, but the kind that sat heavy in the air, thick and palpable. They walked in silence, and though the mayor's steps were hurried, almost anxious, Martha kept a steady pace, her cane tapping softly with each step, as though she was in no particular rush to get anywhere. She wasn't, not really. She had already been where she needed to be, had already seen enough of the world to know what it could and couldn't offer. The mayor's attempt to walk beside her was a gesture, one that held some meaning, but it wasn't enough to erase the sting of what had already happened, of what always seemed to happen to people like her. She had lived this story before, watched it unfold in different ways, with different faces, but always the same ending. The mayor cleared his throat, breaking the silence, his voice a mixture of remorse and something like resolve. Martha, I know this isn't enough, what I said. It can't fix the damage, but I want to do more. I want to make sure something like this doesn't happen again, to you or anyone else. I can't change the past, but I can change the future. Martha didn't respond at first. Instead, she glanced over at him, her eyes sharp and full of years lived through the battles of a lifetime spent fighting for a place, for recognition, for a seat at the table that would always seem to be just out of reach. She knew the language of power and the promises that came with it. She had heard it all before, and she had learned the hard way that words meant little when actions spoke so much louder. You think it's just about the mayor's office, don't you? She finally said, her voice low but clear as they approached the corner of the street. The mayor looked at her, his brows furrowing, trying to understand the weight of her words, but Martha was already shaking her head, almost to herself. It's not about your office. It's about how people like me are treated, even when we don't ask for anything, even when we've already given everything we have. Your office, your speeches, they mean nothing to me right now. Because, Mr. Mayor, I've seen how you treat people like me. Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were the truth that had been buried under years of polite smiles, hidden in meetings where people nodded and agreed, but did nothing. the truth that had been ignored by well-meaning people in power who had never had to fight for anything in their lives. The mayor stopped walking, and for a brief moment, they stood on the sidewalk, the bustling city moving around them, people walking past, unaware of the conversation taking place just inches away from them. "I'm not angry at you," Martha continued, her voice softer now, but still filled with the quiet strength of someone who had weathered decades of pain. "I'm angry at a system that's taught me to be invisible, that's taught people like me that we don't matter. It's not about you being sorry, Mr. Mayor. It's about what comes next. What will you do with that power of yours? Will you change anything? Will you change the way people like me are seen? Or will this be just another moment in a long list of promises made and forgotten?" The mayor stood there for a moment, silent, his face etched with confusion, guilt, and something like a realization, something dawning in him. He had been so focused on what he could do for the city, for the people who came to him with their problems, that he hadn't seen the depth of the problem staring him right in the face. Martha wasn't just talking about his office or about the moment in the lobby where he had failed her. She was talking about a lifetime of being pushed aside, of being told that her voice didn't matter, that she wasn't enough. And in that moment, standing on the cold street with Martha, the mayor realized just how little he had truly seen, just how little he had understood. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice quieter this time, more genuine, as if the apology was finally making its way into his heart. "I didn't see it before. I didn't understand." "No," Martha said, her eyes hard now, like a woman who had heard all the apologies in the world and was no longer interested in hearing them. "You didn't, but you can, and that's what scares people like you, because when you start to see it, when you start to hear it, you can't unsee it, and then you're forced to do something about it. The question is, what will you do when you can't ignore it anymore?" The mayor looked at her, his chest tightening. He had been walking through life, seeing the surface of things, attending meetings, making speeches, believing that progress was happening, that change was being made. But now, standing here, with Martha's words sinking into him like heavy stones, he felt the weight of the truth that his work had never really touched the lives of people like her. Not in any meaningful way. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said finally, the words coming out with a newfound sense of conviction. "I promise you, Martha, I will do whatever it takes to change things." She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if sizing him up, measuring the sincerity of his words against the backdrop of the world she had lived in. For a moment, the silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of everything they had just spoken about, everything they had yet to speak. And then, after a long moment, Martha nodded, just once, almost imperceptibly. "Good," she said simply. "But don't think it's easy. Don't think people like me are asking for you to fix everything. We're asking for you to see us as we are, not as a problem to be solved, or a campaign to be won. We are real people with real stories, and we've been here long before your office, and we'll be here long after you're gone." And with that, Martha turned and began walking again, her cane tapping softly against the pavement, each step a quiet defiance, a refusal to be ignored. The mayor watched her walk away, feeling the weight of her words in the pit of his stomach. He wasn't sure how to fix everything. He wasn't sure how to change the city, how to change the world. But for the first time in his life, he understood that the work wasn't just in passing laws or giving speeches. The real work was in seeing the people who had been hidden for so long, in hearing their stories, and in finally giving them the space they had always deserved. As Martha disappeared around the corner, he turned back toward the building, his mind racing with what he needed to do next. The moment had passed, but the responsibility was now his. The work was just beginning. And for the first time, the mayor didn't look at it as a job. He looked at it as a promise to make things right, to bring real change to the people who had been overlooked, silenced, and forgotten for far too long. Martha had given him a chance he would not waste. The days that followed felt like a blur, a chaotic mix of apologies, meetings, and urgent conversations that promised change but never quite delivered it. Martha knew this pattern too well, the cycle of empty words meant to smooth over a situation without ever addressing the true problem, the truth buried beneath layers of well-intentioned gestures and performative actions. But she wasn't fooled. Not anymore. It was clear to her that the mayor, as sincere as his words had seemed, was part of a system so entrenched in its ways that a single apology, no matter how genuine, wasn't enough to break its hold. The building where she had been turned away still stood tall, its glass doors as cold and distant as they had been when she was forced out. It was still a place where people like her were invisible, where the sound of a black woman's voice was considered a disturbance. The city, despite its efforts to position itself as progressive, was built on the foundation of exclusion and privilege. Martha had seen it all before, and this time she wasn't willing to let it pass unnoticed. It was the following Friday when the press conference was scheduled. The mayor had announced it himself, insisting that he would address the incident with Martha publicly. There would be a public apology, a recommitment to diversity and inclusion for the city's future, and, if the public relations team had their way, a carefully staged event to smooth things over. The mayor had asked Martha to attend, to stand by his side as he delivered his message to the people. The thought of it made her skin crawl. It wasn't that she wanted revenge, it was that she was tired. Tired of being a symbol for a cause she never asked for. Tired of her pain being monetized. Tired of the cycle of broken promises. She had lived through this too many times. Sitting at the kitchen table with her grandson, Isaiah, she looked down at the letter the mayor had sent, inviting her to the press conference. He had called her a beacon of justice and promised to use the event as an opportunity to repair the damage. Martha's fingers tightened around the edges of the paper as she let out a sigh. "I don't think I can do it," she said softly, her voice heavy with resignation. Isaiah looked up from the table where he had been working on his laptop. His expression softened as he put the screen down and leaned back in his chair. "Grandma, I know you've been through a lot. But maybe this could be the moment we've been waiting for. The world will be watching. Maybe they'll finally listen." Martha's eyes flickered with something sharp, but there was also a deep sorrow in them. "And what good will that do, Isaiah? You think the world will suddenly change because the mayor says a few words? You think that when he's done with his speech, the people who hate me, who think people like me don't belong, will suddenly change? You think they'll see me differently? We've been through this before. I don't need their pity. I don't need their empty words." Isaiah stood up, walking over to her side. "But Grandma, it's not just about the words. It's about showing them that we won't be silent anymore. It's about showing them that that we, have a right to be here, to be seen. If we don't take this chance, if we don't make them face the truth, then nothing will ever change." Martha's fingers slowly relaxed, and she placed the letter down on the table. She studied the words, the promises, the carefully crafted sentences meant to soften the harsh reality that lay behind them. Her heart was tired, too tired to hope, too tired to believe that this time would be any different. But she knew what Isaiah said was true. If she didn't stand up now, if she didn't show up for herself, for her people, then she would be complicit in the silence that had allowed so much injustice to go unnoticed for so long. She would be part of the system that let people like her be forgotten. And that she could never be. "I'll go," Martha said quietly, "but don't expect me to be quiet." Isaiah smiled, a flicker of pride in his eyes, though his face was still etched with concern. "I wouldn't expect anything less, Grandma." The press conference was held in a grand hall, a room filled with bright lights, cameras, and reporters all waiting for the moment when the mayor would address the scandal that had rocked the city. Martha sat quietly in the front row, her cane resting beside her, her body still but alert, as she watched the mayor prepare himself on stage. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, the tension in the air thick with expectation. This was it, the moment where she would either be seen as a symbol of change, or as just another figure in a narrative that didn't belong to her. The mayor took the stage, his face serious, his voice calm as he began his speech. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I stand before you today to address an incident that should never have happened. A moment when we failed to live up to the values of this city. A moment when one of our own, a respected leader in our community, was treated with disrespect and indignity." Martha felt the heat of the cameras as they turned toward her, but she didn't flinch. Her eyes remained steady on the mayor as he continued, his words carefully chosen, his tone measured. He spoke of the city's commitment to inclusion, to diversity, to creating a space where everyone could belong. But as she listened, Martha could feel the hollowness of his promises, the emptiness behind his words. This wasn't about real change. This was about damage control, about making the city look good in front of the cameras, about offering an apology that would satisfy the public without ever addressing the root cause of the problem. And so, the mayor continued, we are taking immediate steps to ensure that something like this never happens again. We are strengthening our commitment to diversity training, to creating more inclusive spaces for all people. And we will be working closely with community leaders like Martha to ensure that our city remains a place where everyone feels safe and valued. Martha's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. She had heard all of this before. The words sounded nice, but they were just that. Words. The true test would come after the cameras were gone, after the speeches were forgotten. Would the city really change? Or would it go back to its old ways, pretending that diversity could be achieved with a few gestures, a few slogans, a few meetings? The work was deeper than that. The work was in the hearts of the people, and the mayor wasn't talking about that. Martha stood up slowly, her cane tapping lightly on the floor. The room fell silent as she made her way to the microphone. The mayor's face turned pale as she approached, and for a moment, the crowd seemed to hold its breath, unsure of what would happen next. She looked around the room, her gaze steady, unflinching. I appreciate the words, Mr. Mayor, she said, her voice clear and strong. But I'm not here for words. I'm here to see if you're truly willing to make this city what you say it can be. Because you see, I've heard these promises before. I've lived through these speeches, these photo ops, these commitments to change. But change doesn't come in speeches. It doesn't come from a press release. It comes from the people in this room, people who are ready to listen, to learn, to act. It comes from people who are willing to confront the ugly truth that is this city's history and its present. She paused, her voice unwavering. I've spent my life fighting for a city that would never fully accept me, that would always find ways to push me aside, to make me invisible. And that fight hasn't stopped. But the fight isn't just for me. It's for every person who's ever been told they don't belong, who's been turned away, who's been silenced. And I'm tired of waiting for you to fix it with words. I'm tired of waiting for you to see me. Martha looked directly at the mayor, her eyes piercing. You want to make this right, Mr. Mayor? Then prove it. Don't tell me what you'll do. Show me. Don't promise me inclusion. Show me what it looks like in action, not just in words. Because words mean nothing if they're not backed by real change. And with that, she turned and walked off the stage, leaving the room in stunned silence. The mayor stood there, his mouth slightly open, unsure of what to say, but knowing that her words had struck deeper than anything he had prepared for. Martha didn't need to say anything else. She had already said it all. The weeks following Martha's bold stand at the press conference were filled with the kind of silence that often comes after a storm, the kind that leaves behind wreckage and broken pieces that can never be fully repaired. The mayor, though shaken, continued to push for the reforms he had promised. But Martha could sense that the world around her wasn't ready for real change. The press had moved on, the cameras had long since packed up, and now the streets were filled with the same people who had once clapped for her in public, but who now walked past her without a second glance, as if they had forgotten her face, forgotten her name. The promises made in the heat of the moment now seemed hollow, fading like old paint on a crumbling wall. Martha sat on her front porch, the warmth of the sun touching her skin, though she could barely feel it through the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. The world around her had returned to its rhythm, but it wasn't the same for her. She wasn't the same. The silence was suffocating, thick with unspoken truths and half-hearted apologies. The city had moved on, but the small, lingering piece of her that had hoped for change now felt like it was drowning. Isaiah had tried to keep her busy. He insisted she attend rallies, meet with other community leaders, keep pushing the cause forward. But it was hard to keep moving when you could feel the system tightening around you, trying to trap you in its silence. And then there were the looks, the ones that followed her as she walked through the neighborhood, the ones that pierced through her like arrows, as if they were waiting for her to fail, to falter, to prove them right. They didn't want her to succeed. They didn't want her to win. They didn't want a black woman who had lived through decades of struggle to be the voice of a movement that challenged the very foundation of their privilege. They wanted her to go away quietly, to disappear into the shadows where she belonged. But Martha was no stranger to being made invisible. She had lived through a lifetime of that. It was the afternoon of the second town hall meeting that would mark the official launch of the mayor's Inclusion Initiative. And Martha sat in the back of the room, watching as the mayor prepared his speech. His words were polished, rehearsed, and the audience responded with the same energy they had before, clapping, nodding, eager to believe that things were changing. They didn't see what she saw, the carefully constructed facade that covered the truth. They didn't understand that the initiative wasn't about giving people like her a seat at the table. It was about making people like her feel included without actually changing anything. They didn't see that the mayor had found a way to make his promises sound good without actually taking the hard steps to create real, systemic change. Martha's eyes drifted to the faces in the crowd. The well-dressed, well-spoken, well-meaning individuals who clung to the illusion that their city was evolving. But they weren't evolving. They were adjusting. They were adjusting to the growing noise of people like Martha, who were demanding to be heard. But that noise was being met with smooth words and polite gestures that didn't touch the root of the problem. The mayor finished his speech, and the crowd erupted in applause. But Martha didn't clap. She didn't smile. She didn't even nod. She just watched, her gaze sharp and unwavering, as the mayor took his seat and the next round of speakers began. The focus was no longer on her, but it never had been. She had only been a symbol, a token to showcase at the beginning. But now that the cameras were gone, so was the real interest in her story. So was the genuine concern for the problems she had raised. After the event, as people began to filter out, Martha stood up slowly, her cane tapping the floor, and she made her way toward the exit. She had made her point. She had spoken her truth, but the real work was not in the speeches or the applause. It was in the streets, in the homes, in the places where people like her still didn't have a voice, where her story still wasn't being told. She was tired, yes, but she was also resolute. The fight wasn't over. It would never be over, not until they could change what was inside the hearts of the people who held the power. She stepped outside into the cool evening air, Isaiah waiting for her on the steps. He had been watching from the back, his eyes on her throughout the entire event, but he knew better than to push her into responding to the applause or the crowd. He knew what it meant for her to sit there, to listen, to absorb everything without reacting. She didn't need his approval. She didn't need the approval of anyone in that room. She needed something deeper, something more fundamental. She needed them to see her. As she approached him, he stood up, taking her arm gently. "You okay, Grandma?" he asked, his voice soft, filled with concern. Martha gave him a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, Isaiah. I've been fine for a long time." He knew what she meant. She had been fine, yes, but it was the kind of fine that had been built on years of endurance, of holding back what she truly felt, of suppressing the rage and pain that came from being treated as less than human. The kind of fine that came with knowing that no matter how much you gave, no matter how much you fought, the system was always going to find a way to silence you again. The system was not built for her. It was built for people like the ones who had clapped in that room, who had nodded and smiled without ever truly hearing her. "You don't have to do this alone, Grandma," Isaiah said, his voice filled with the quiet determination that matched her own. "You've already done so much, but if you're tired, if you need to rest, just say the word. We can step back. We can take a break." Martha shook her head slowly, her eyes looking distant, as if she were seeing something beyond him, something far away. "Rest won't change anything, Isaiah. We've been resting for too long. They want us to rest. They want us to fade into the background, to forget that we're here. But we can't do that anymore. Not when people like us are still invisible. Not when the system is still trying to bury us." Isaiah opened his mouth to respond, but Martha stopped him with a look, her voice firm and final. "We can rest when it's over, but it's not over yet." And with that, they began walking down the street together, side by side, as the world continued on around them, Martha wasn't looking for approval anymore. She wasn't looking for validation or applause. What she needed was something the world was reluctant to give. True, lasting change. And she would fight for it until her last breath. The days stretched on after Martha's speech at the town hall. The mayor's promises to implement a more inclusive city echoed through the halls of city government. But Martha could feel the emptiness of them with every step she took in the streets. The city had a way of making people feel important when the cameras were rolling, when the spotlight was on them. But the moment the attention shifted, the words faded away like mist, and the same old systems reasserted themselves, silent but powerful, unyielding in their indifference. Martha had seen it all before, and she knew the truth. No matter how many press conferences, no matter how many speeches, the system wouldn't change unless the very core of it was ripped out, piece by piece. The mayor had done what he could to smooth over the public relations disaster. But the truth was clear. His initiative was little more than a temporary balm over a wound that ran deep, and while the media had moved on to the next scandal, Martha remained a symbol, a casualty of a system that only pretended to care. She spent her days in the quiet of her home, tending to the small garden in her backyard, her cane leaning against the doorframe as she worked the soil with careful hands. Her body was slowing down. Age, fatigue, the weight of too many years of fighting, of standing firm when the world demanded she bend. But her mind was sharp, and her heart still burned with the fire of the battles that had defined her life. But this new battle, this battle for true justice, for true recognition, was different. It wasn't about speeches anymore. It wasn't about the cameras or the applause. It was about a quiet, insidious kind of fight. The fight against the systems that had taught people like her to be invisible, to be silent, to be forgotten. Isaiah had continued his work with the mayor's office, pushing for tangible change. But even he was starting to feel the strain. The weight of his grandfather's legacy, the promise to make the world better, to make it more inclusive, more just, these were heavy burdens to carry. And Martha could see it in his eyes. The hope was still there, but it was beginning to fade. The world had a way of grinding hope down, of turning it into cynicism, into resignation. One afternoon, as she sat on her porch, staring out at the street, she saw a familiar face walking down the sidewalk. Someone she hadn't seen in years. A man she knew well, one who had been by her side in many of the protests in her youth, who had fought alongside her for the same ideals. His name was Samuel, and they had lost touch over the years. He had been a lawyer, a passionate advocate for civil rights, but somewhere along the way, the fight had taken its toll on him. He had retreated into the quieter corners of the world, seeking peace after decades of turmoil. "Samuel!" she called out, her voice carrying over the street, and the man stopped, his eyes locking onto hers with recognition. A faint smile tugged at his lips as he made his way toward her. "Martha," he said softly, his voice tinged with something between joy and sadness. "I didn't think I'd see you here. Thought you'd be up there with the mayor, stirring up trouble as usual." Martha chuckled, the sound dry, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I've stirred enough trouble in my day, Samuel. But this city hasn't changed. Not really. Not the way it needs to." He sat down beside her, and for a moment, they were silent, watching the cars go by, hearing the sounds of children playing in the distance. There was a quiet comfort in being with someone who understood, who had lived through the same battles, felt the same exhaustion. "I know what you mean," Samuel said after a while, his voice low. "I've been to those meetings, heard the speeches, listened to the promises, but nothing changes, not really. We're just another generation of voices lost in the wind." Martha nodded, her fingers curling around the edge of her cane. "And that's the problem, Samuel. They want us to keep talking, keep asking, but they never listen. They hear us, but they don't listen. And when they do listen, they do it for their own benefit, not ours. They're not interested in real change. They're interested in making it look like change is happening so they can stay comfortable." Samuel's face tightened, his jaw clenching as if he were trying to hold back the flood of emotion that always seemed to follow such conversations. "I've been thinking about it a lot, Martha. About all of us, about the fight we've been in for so long. And I think we're losing. I think we've lost. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but in the long run, the system has won. Martha's eyes hardened, the fire that had never truly gone out flaring up once more. The system doesn't win, she said, her voice stronger now. It only wins if we let it. And I'm not letting it win. Not today. Not ever. Samuel looked at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. What are you saying, Martha? We've been fighting this fight for decades. We've seen the victories, and we've seen the setbacks. We've seen what happens when people rise up, and we've seen how quickly they're brought down. This fight isn't just about words anymore. It's about survival. And we've survived, but I don't think there's more to be done. Martha stood up slowly, her cane tapping against the ground with a sharp click that punctuated her words. Survival isn't enough, Samuel. You can survive, but if you don't live, if you don't push for what's right, if you don't keep fighting for what's just, then what are we doing? We're just existing. That's not enough for me. Samuel rose with her, his face creased with concern. But what else is there to do? We've fought for equality, for rights, for recognition, and every time we're pushed back. Every time the system finds a way to shut us down. It's exhausting, Martha. And the younger generation, they're tired too. They don't want to fight anymore. They just want peace, and I don't think they'll ever get it. Martha turned to him, her gaze unwavering. You're wrong, Samuel. The younger generation is tired because they've been handed a broken system. A system that keeps promising them everything but delivering nothing. They're tired because they don't see the change that was promised. But they will see it. They'll see it in the streets. They'll see it in the hearts of the people who still refuse to be silenced. You think this fight is over? No. It's just beginning. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle between them. And I'm not done fighting, not until the last breath in my body. Samuel didn't speak for a moment, his eyes searching hers for a hint of the woman who had once been his partner in the fight, the one who had inspired him to push for justice in the face of a world that didn't. Kare. He saw it now, deep in her eyes, the fire that had never gone out, and it made him wonder. Maybe, just maybe, she was right. Maybe there was still a chance. Maybe the fight wasn't over. I don't know if I can keep going, Martha, he said finally, his voice quiet. But I'll stand beside you. If you think there's still hope, then maybe I'll stand with you. Martha smiled, though it was a weary smile, the kind that came with years of knowing the cost of hope. That's all I ask, Samuel. Stand with me, and we'll show them what real change looks like. As they stood there, together again, the weight of the city around them, the noise of the world moving forward, Martha felt a quiet determination in her bones. She wasn't done yet, and as long as she still had breath in her body, she would keep fighting, keep pushing, keep demanding to be seen. The system hadn't won, not yet, and it wouldn't, as long as people like Martha refused to let it. The day of the protest had come, the final stand. It was the culmination of years of work, years of standing alone, years of fighting against a system that had never truly seen her. Martha stood on the steps of the city hall, the very same steps where she had been kicked out, humiliated, dismissed. The crowd was small, but it didn't matter. The mayor's promises had turned into empty air, like all the others before him. They had promised her change, but what had they really delivered? More speeches, more apologies, more empty gestures. Martha's cane tapped against the steps with a rhythmic determination, her fingers tightening around it as she looked out at the small crowd gathered before her. The younger generation had come, their faces a mix of hope and exhaustion. They had heard the speeches, they had seen the empty promises, and now they were ready to do something about it. They were tired of waiting for change to come from those in power who had never had to live in the kind of world they did. They were tired of watching as the old systems ground down everything that was good, everything that had been fought for. And so they stood with her, not because she was some symbol of hope, but because they knew her story. They had seen it in their own lives. They had felt the sting of the same kind of silence that had once crushed her. Martha had seen it all. Too many faces in the crowd, too many rallies, too many broken promises. But this time she wasn't standing alone. Her grandson, Isaiah, stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, a sign of strength and solidarity. He was the future, the one who would carry the weight of everything she had fought for. But today, she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every black woman, every disabled person, every person who had ever been made to feel less than, invisible. And she was fighting for them, even if no one else would. The march began with a slow, deliberate pace, the chants rising up from the crowd. Not for her, but for all of them. For everyone who had ever been told their voices didn't matter. The city hall loomed in the distance, the building that had once stood as a symbol of authority and progress, now a silent witness to the struggle that had been waged outside its walls for years. The doors that had once been closed to her were now standing open, but not for the reasons they had hoped. They were open because of people like Martha, because of the fight that would not die. But as they approached the front of the building, something shifted in the air, something Martha had seen too many times before. A group of well-dressed city officials emerged from the doors, their faces tight with discomfort. The mayor wasn't with them. She had expected that. He wasn't brave enough to face her in public, not after everything that had happened. He would hide behind the rhetoric of progress, the language of inclusion. But the truth was clear. The mayor had never wanted change. He wanted power. He wanted comfort. He wanted things to stay the same, just polished up for the cameras. One of the officials, a woman who had once smiled at Martha during one of her public appearances, stepped forward. Her gaze was cool, calculated. "Martha," she said, her voice formal, as if nothing had happened. "We've received your letter. The mayor isn't available right now, but we want to assure you that we're working on the issues you've raised." Martha didn't flinch, didn't look away. She had seen this exact same performance too many times. "Working on the issues," she repeated, her voice dripping with irony. "Funny, it's been years, and I've heard that same line over and over again. You've been working on the issues, while people like me have been told to stay quiet, to disappear." "Well, I'm not going anywhere, and neither are the people in this crowd." The woman's face tightened, but she didn't interrupt. She had heard this before too. The tired speeches, the accusations that they had been doing nothing, that they had only pretended to care. But Martha's words hit different now. They weren't just words. They were a declaration, a line in the sand. "I'm done with being polite," Martha said, her voice loud now so that everyone in the crowd could hear her. "I'm done with letting people like you tell me that change is coming while it's been coming for decades, while it's been coming for generations. I'm done with pretending that the promises mean anything when I see the same damn thing happening every day. I'm done with waiting." The crowd was silent for a moment. The officials shifted uncomfortably, the tension building in the air. Martha could feel their eyes on her, but it didn't matter. The years of being invisible, the years of being overlooked, had brought her to this moment. And in that moment, she wasn't afraid. She was ready. "We will not be silenced anymore," she continued, her voice steady and firm. "You want to talk about progress? You want to talk about equality? Show me. Don't tell me. Don't offer me a seat at a table where you've already decided who gets to speak and who doesn't. If you're truly committed to change, then start by listening. Start by seeing us. Not as your token, not as your opportunity for a photo op, but as people with lives, with stories, with struggles. You've ignored us for too long." The official stepped back, her eyes narrowing, but she didn't say a word. There was nothing left to say. Martha had said it all. The mayor had failed. The city had failed. And now it was up to the people to rise, to take back the power that had been stolen from them, to refuse to be silenced any longer. Martha turned to the crowd, and for the first time in a long time, she saw the spark of determination in their eyes, the fire that had been waiting for the right moment to ignite. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for them, for all of them. "I've spent my life fighting, and I'll keep fighting," she said, her voice ringing out, stronger than before. "But this fight isn't just mine. It's all of ours. It's for every person who's been told they don't belong. It's for every person who's been pushed aside, told their voice doesn't matter. It's for every child who's been taught that their skin, their body, their existence is less than. We will not stop. Not until the world sees us. Not until the world hears us." And with that, She turned away from the officials and began walking toward the steps of City Hall, the crowd following her, their chants growing louder, stronger. The officials could do nothing but watch. The moment had passed. The protest had begun, and this time, Martha wasn't standing alone. As the crowd gathered in front of City Hall, Martha felt a surge of energy. She wasn't just standing in front of a building anymore. She was standing on the edge of something much larger. This was no longer about speeches, no longer about words. This was about action. This was about making the world listen, and the world would listen, whether they liked it or not. Martha had no illusions about what the fight would take. She knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew it wouldn't be quick. But she also knew this. It was her fight to lead, and it was a fight she would win. Not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't matter, for everyone who had ever been silenced. And as the crowd stood with her, chanting and marching, Martha felt the weight of the past lift just a little. Because today, they had made a choice. They had chosen to be seen. They had chosen to be heard. And together, they would never be invisible again. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Have you ever experienced racism or seen it happen in your life? Your experiences and opinions are incredibly important to us, and we truly value every one of you who engages with our content. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated with more stories like this. We appreciate your support so much. Have a great day, and please leave a comment saying, "I am not invisible," so we know you listened until the end.